Cool. Hey guys. So I'm Josh Keeling. I work at a startup called UtilityAPI, which is not really important for this. I'm here to sort of give like a practitioner focus on the clean energy transition, talk about some of the practical challenges and opportunities. A little bit of background on me. In addition to working at a startup, I'm an occasional adjunct at Portland State University. Just recently taught a graduate course in the Center for Public Service on energy policy, so I dabble in education. Before coming to UtilityAPI, I've been at a couple of other clean tech companies. I worked at a manufacturer of batteries, a company called Generac that also does backup power. And then probably relevant to this as well, I worked at Portland General Electric, where I led resource planning for a period of time, as well as distribution planning. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about around planning for the clean energy transition, I've been involved in. Was excited to hear the talk about closing of Boardman. I was really involved in that, and it was a really big milestone for the state, and a lot of hard work that went into finding replacement resources for that. So let's just get into it. I'm keenly aware that I'm between you and lunch right now, so, am I not? Cool. I'll yell into this thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about energy in the Northwest. I know Amy talked about this a bit, but I just want to give a little additional context there. And then I'm going to just talk about some general trends, so things that are happening in the energy transition that I think are important context. A lot of the conversation so far has been around the science of like how to make the electricity. There is a lot of hard stuff around that. And actually, if we look at a lot of the barriers that we're facing right now, as we look to further decarbonize the power sector, it's a lot of the non-engineering parts of it that are actually causing us the problems right now. We have a pretty good grasp on at least the first 80% of the problem. So then I'm going to talk about some case studies that I think are helpful in giving context when you're talking to your students and talking about how these technologies actually show up, both in the Northwest and broadly, and then just some quick conclusions. So just quick reminder, the Northwest is pretty unique when it comes to energy in a lot of ways. One is just the abundant hydro resource that was bestowed upon us as a part of the New Deal about a century ago. The other part of that is just having ample transmission. I'm going to talk about transmission quite a bit. We focus a lot on the power generation, but getting it to places is actually a really big problem in a lot of ways. The other part of this, which I'll touch on in the sort of opportunities and challenges section, is talking about the fact that we've had largely independently operated utilities. So our utilities have not operated within a market. So Ian had talked about Texas earlier. Texas is almost the complete opposite of what we face here. It is fully deregulated, completely competitive. It's all market-based, just about. Whereas here, most of our utilities are either regulated or publicly owned and operate autonomously. That's pretty unique. The only other place in the United States that's like that is the Southeast, for similar reasons. The other thing to keep in mind is just the dramatic decreases in the costs of renewable power, in particular wind and solar, but also batteries. Coupling that with a pretty aggressive array of climate goals is leading to a rapid acceleration and transformation of the sector, and driven a lot of growth in non-hydro, non-fossil resources. And then also the electrification and the need for backup power in particular. As we look at climate affects us in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about. One is that it makes power less reliable because lines get knocked over, or in some cases, lines start fires. And so that has created a much bigger interest in decentralization of the power sector. And then I just want to note, because it comes up quite a bit when I start talking about this, the Bonneville Power Administration looms pretty large around this, including the BEF folks, who get a good amount of funding from them. But that's also a pretty unique arrangement. So the Bonneville Power Administration is a public entity that sort of operates autonomously as a business in some sense, and oversees the administration of the hydro system and the transmission networks in much of the Northwest. And that's another thing that's sort of an interesting overlay. So just real quick on the power mix in the region. So this is for the whole Northwest system, which I think is the best way to sort of think about these things. This is what our power is largely made of, which is hydro. The other part that I want to point out, because a lot of the conversation about renewable resources really focuses on solar in this sort of dominant conversation, Largely, that's not what's coming into the Northwest. So we are a much more wind-dominant region. That is due both to our geography, but also because of that giant water battery that we have standing behind it, which helps to integrate that wind. Wind is highly productive, but it is also highly variable, and balancing that out to serve our needs is complex, but hydro is flexible, and that is a unique arrangement that we have in the Northwest. But the other part of this that is less related to clean energy transition, but important to keep in mind, is if we look up here in the top left, this is our capacity additions over the last 10 or so years. That big red negative is Boardman coming offline. But you'll see here that you have a lot of wind coming on, but also a lot of natural gas. So that's another big transition that's taken place across the country and in the Northwest, which is a lot of the decarbonization of the power sector has actually been transitioning from coal to gas. And that has helped in the interim to reduce our emissions, but in the long term is not necessarily a sustainable path forward. Focusing a little bit more on the Northwest, something to keep in mind as you sort of talk about the clean energy transition is also how it affects our existing renewable power resources. So as climate changes, it changes how renewable resources, which are highly weather dependent, produce power. And a lot of folks will talk about things like, oh, well, it's hotter, there's more sun, we have more solar, and wind can act in very interesting ways because it's much more related to sort of storm conditions and volatile changes in weather. But one that doesn't get talked a lot about is how it affects the hydro system, which is really important for us here in the Northwest. So in particular, what happens with climate change is less that you have, your average precipitation generally is steady, but what really changes is that it becomes more erratic. So you have really dry years and then you have really wet years. And it has a tendency to come in spurts. So it doesn't evenly distribute throughout the year. And that is problematic because we're highly reliant on snowmelt. And so what happens in the hydro system is that you have storage in two places. One, it sits in the river and we can affect how we run it. The other is that it sits on the mountain as ice and slowly melts off. And if the water comes late, then you don't have the storage. And if you don't need it at the time, it just spills. And so that is another part where the flexibility and the predictability of the hydro system is largely affected by climate change. So some quick trends that are true both in the Northwest and broadly that I'd like to talk about. One is just regional integration. So one of the big things that comes out of renewable power is that you need to rely more on your neighbors. And that is because diversity is our friend when it comes to power generation. This was always true when we planned for load. So the reason that we are able to generate the right amount of power for the amount of use is because of diversity. It's the law of large numbers. Each of you is not very predictable on your own, but in average, you're very predictable. And so if we aggregate all your load together, it's very useful. When you have unpredictable power sources, which is true for a lot of renewable resources, the same is true. So the more sources we have from more different places, the more effective we are. This is also because of the issue of that things are more sensitive to weather. Both load and generation are becoming more sensitive to weather, as well as reliability. And all of those coming together in unique ways causes more complications. That also means that when we use energy is almost as important, if not more important, than how much we use. A lot of our focus has been on efficiency, but now we're spending a lot more time talking about when we are using power. This is also particularly true as we look to electrify end uses. So a lot of the change that's now happening on the usage side is around electrification of fossil fuel end uses, whether it's within vehicles or in heating homes or heating water or industrial processes. And overlaid on all of this is a very big layer of regulatory and business model change. So the players that historically operated in this space were largely monopolies and governments. And now, despite all of the conversation around policy, it's increasingly being driven by businesses and local communities. And while that change is really exciting, it's also very disruptive. So, changes in generation and load. The big thing to keep in mind in the Northwest is something that a lot of folks, I'm here in the Willamette Valley, we experienced this quite acutely a few years ago, is the dramatic increase in extreme heat. And with that comes the need for air conditioning. I grew up in Oregon. I've been here my whole life. It used to be it was weird to see somebody that had air conditioning. That was like a strange thing. And those who did just turned it on when it got really bad. They never, they didn't have the thermostat all the time. It was just like something you flipped on. I remember as a kid, we would always just buy window air conditioners when we needed them, and then they would just sit in the garage. That has really changing. So on the left, this is trends in air conditioning, particularly in single-family homes, but increasingly this is actually becoming a safety issue in urban areas, which is just completely unheard of in the Northwest. On the right is what happens to the power, the net load curve as we bring more solar on. So net load curves are saying what is consumption minus the renewables that we need to take. And if you start to rely heavily on solar, what happens is you basically create a duck. You create this curve that says we have this big fat belly of this duck, and to get to the top of the neck, we need a lot of resources that can ramp on very quickly. And the renewable resources that can do that are scarce. So that creates a complicated problem. In terms of our power mix, though, it is definitely trending towards more decarbonization and more decentralization. On the right is the forecasted behind-the-meter solar, so that is solar on people's roofs or on businesses. An enormous growth is happening and is expected to continue there. On the left is levelized cost of energy. I want to sort of dispel a notion here about, I think there's a bit of a narrative that it is policy that is driving the adoption of clean energy. Back to our Texas example, which has effectively no clean energy policy, it is actually the largest producer and developer of clean energy. And the reason for that is it's very easy to permit in Texas because there's effectively no laws, and renewable energy is really cheap. Now it's really cheap because of a lot of intervention that happened earlier on in research and development and building up businesses, particularly in the Obama administration, coming out of the initial recession. But on the left here, this is unsubsidized cost of power. And you will see that everything that is the cheapest in the Northwest, which is not the sunniest place in the region, is solar. And even when you get to the far right, solar and batteries is cheaper than a peaker plant. So that is a plant that you're building just for the occasional peak needs. So it is very much the case that we're seeing a much cheaper profile, unsubsidized or not. In addition, what we're seeing is a transformation structurally in how the power grid works. So the way the power grid was originally built is very top-down. So the idea was you have no idea how people are using energy, so get as many of them together, connect them all to the same wires, and build some giant power plants in the middle of nowhere to serve them, and just run them all the time. And that paradigm worked for a really long time when you had abundant fossil fuels or hydro, and you could build infrastructure willy-nilly based on government subsidies and protective regulation. However, what we're seeing now is a lot of disruption happening downstream. So at people's homes, at people's businesses, that really changes that. Some of that is just digitalization. Some of that is cheaper power. So if you look at a lot of the renewable resources, particularly lithium-ion batteries and rooftop solar or just solar panels, they don't have economies of scale nearly to the level that thermal power plants. A big power plant in thermal is much cheaper than building a small one. These are much more modular. This is why we can have little kits with tiny little solar panels and tiny little batteries, because they scale down to very small levels thanks to economies we found in things like aerospace and cell phones. So what that's leading to is a highly decentralized system, which is creating quite a bit of a mess, but I think largely in a good way. What's interesting and what I think is exciting here is it gives you a lot of opportunities to connect things to your communities, because a lot more of what happens with power is local. That's both in terms of the ill effects that are happening, in terms of energy injustice, in terms of reliability disparities, in terms of environmental impacts, but it's also true in terms of solutions. A lot more of the power solutions can be created locally, both in terms of the jobs and where the benefits are accrued. So let's talk about some challenges and opportunities. This map right here, and I highly recommend, I have at the end, go to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's website. They have an incredible amount of information that's publicly available specific to the Northwest. This map is of all the power generating facilities in the Northwest. You can imagine what those blue ones are, but don't be mistaken, those yellow ones are not actually solar. It's a bad color choice here for the Power Council. Yellow is natural gas. These light blue ones are all the wind plants. You'll see. So the first challenge and opportunity that I want to talk about is wholesale markets. So a big change that is happening is regional integration. This is true for a number of reasons. One is that transmission is very difficult to build, but the other is to leverage that diversity. And what's interesting about that is it increases reliance between states that previously did not work with each other. It creates new sort of relationships and new dynamics. You find really interesting things like Idaho being one of the most aggressive on decarbonization, and there's a good reason for that. It's because they have the most hydropower. So Idaho Power, which is an incredibly conservative utility and incredibly conservative state, is actually one of the leaders in decarbonization. We talked a little bit about this, and I want to touch on some of the non-engineering parts of this, which is some of the emerging renewable technologies. There's a lot of focus that people like to get into the newest technology, but I would like to talk sort of about what we're seeing, particularly in Oregon, actually. There's some really interesting developments happening. One is in offshore wind. So Southern Oregon and Northern California is one of the richest sources of potential offshore wind in the United States, and it is completely untapped. The difficulty of that, besides the fact that there is not necessarily a robust offshore wind industry in the United States right now, is that the ocean outside of the Pacific coast is extremely deep. So this is just a cliff, continental cliff that happens. So unlike the East Coast, where we're already starting to see large development of offshore wind, which is anchored to the ground, here it has to float, which is, we just did a little demonstration, which is great. That technology exists. Scandinavia, of all places, has leveraged a historical capability in building oil rigs to get really good at building offshore wind. So there's a lot of work being done to develop there. There's been some federal bids that have gone out, but this has a lot of complications that come with it, both positive and negative. One, I mean, my brother was a commercial fisherman, so I get to hear about this all the time. Putting a bunch of windmills outside of Coos Bay can be incredibly disruptive to those folks who are looking to who make their livelihood by fishing tuna. So that has a potential disruption, both in terms of interruptions of fishing routes, but also in the use of the marinas. So the harbors that are used get particularly disrupted. The flip side of that, from a beneficial perspective, is that a little known fact about offshore wind, it almost entirely has to be built where you're putting it out. It is very expensive to move tremendously large wind turbines across the country. It was hard onshore. Offshore is about 3 times larger often. So if you're going to go to the trouble of putting something in the water, you're going to make it as big as you possibly can. And so what happens is that you do most of the manufacturing actually in the port. So it creates a tremendous amount of jobs, but it also crowds out whoever else was using that port for something. A little bit different issue, but also coming up, is around some of the other more promising renewable technologies. Those are geothermal and pumped hydro. Geothermal power is actually a very well developed technology from a generation perspective. The hard part is actually figuring out where the right place to put it is. It's actually a lot like drilling for oil. It's very expensive to find the resource and get into it. So speculation is expensive, but development is actually straightforward. The other issue is then getting that power from the middle of nowhere, usually where you're getting it from, to where you need to go. Similarly, pumped hydro, which is effectively building lakes on mountaintops and using them as water batteries, is a case of it's actually the largest source of storage in the United States on a megawatt hour basis, but is very difficult to build and has large potential consequences from an ecological perspective. The other trouble, which I will get to in a second, is transmission, again, especially in Oregon, where much of the transmission pathways need to go through tribal land. Gas. So I had a really fun time watching us all struggle to make hydrogen. It was a good analogy for the way it works in real life. So the role of gas, both in the Northwest and broadly, is a huge area of interest and complication. There's a number of reasons, sort of just regulatorily, why this is difficult, because you have sort of regulated utilities. So we have Northwest Natural here, which is a monopoly, whose whole business is selling gas. How they decarbonize their system is very difficult. So there's a few options in terms of literally decarbonizing the gas. One is renewable natural gas, which is typically capturing methane from naturally occurring sources. The second is green hydrogen, so that's using electrolysis to turn water into hydrogen using renewable power sources. Renewable natural gas is a tremendously interesting and exciting resource. The problem is there's just not enough feedstock. So the reality is almost all the good sources of renewable natural gas are already taken. In fact, prior to environmental regulations, many wastewater treatment plants were already capturing natural gas because it was just happened to be that they had a bunch of natural gas that they were coming off their process already that they could burn for their own purposes, both from a reliability perspective and from like just a cost of service perspective where they face large rates. But now anybody who didn't has already been paid by somebody as an off-taker. Similarly for things like dairies. Most dairies are already capturing their methane. The long tail of that is actually the small family farms. So all of the large factory farms virtually in this country are now have some form of methane capture happening. So the problem we have now is we don't have many more naturally occurring sources. So if we wanted more, we would actually have to create dedicated feedstocks, which introduces a whole other set of complications. That is, you'd be growing plants to then let them rot, to then take the gas off of them and light it on fire. Seems a little iffy from an environmental perspective and is very expensive. Green hydrogen suffers from a supply chain issue and from just a complication issue. There are many steps in the process of generating green hydrogen. One is you have to have renewable power, which is cheap, and that's fine. But to justify the high cost of electrolysis, you need to use that electrolyzer a lot. There's not a lot of renewable that's running all the time, and those that are already spoken for. Then the other part is you have to compress it and then or put it into a pipeline. Those pipelines don't exist. You can't really use natural gas pipelines for hydrogen. The molecules are much smaller and they leak a lot. And compression obviously uses energy. So, but overlay this to not be naive, gas is a really important resource right now for reliability. When things go sideways on the power sector, it is almost always gas that turns on. That is, I mean, we either turn on gas or we turn people's lights off. And so we cannot neglect that. The dispatchable power is really important. So trying to manage through that while dealing with the very real consequences of this system is important. Transmission. Transmission is probably the thorniest issue we could talk about in energy. It is thorny for every reason you can imagine. The physics of transmission are very straightforward. We've done it for a long time. There was a question about losses earlier. Transmission losses roughly on most systems is around 3%. So it's bad, but it's not the end of the world, and it's getting better with high voltage DC transmission. The issue with transmission is, one, it's really hard to get built because of permitting, because nobody wants transmission in their backyard. Nobody does. Everybody's like, I want transmission, but I don't want to see it. And honestly, back to energy justice, the people who usually end up with a transmission in their backyard are the poorest neighborhoods and the rural communities who don't have a voice necessarily at the table. The other issue that I think we all saw over the last few years is that transmission is now interacting with climate change in a new way, which is that it is causing wildfires. So it is now becoming much more expensive to maintain transmission, and utilities and transmission operators are much more cautious to build it because they face the liabilities, like PacifiCorp just did, of like hundreds of millions of dollars for lost lives and homes. There's a lot of work being done at the federal level to help speed this, but honestly, much of the issues that come up are at the local and local jurisdictions. Role of hydropower is also changing quite a bit. It is not just a critical power resource. What folks who are not as familiar with how the hydro system work is that it also is a critical resource from an agricultural perspective. Irrigation in this region, we have an incredibly fertile region, and some of it, a lot of that has to do with the irrigation that was created by the federal power system. But we cannot neglect the ecological damage that's being done, as well as the cultural damage that's being done. The most salient area where this is coming up right now is in the conversation around the removal of the lower Snake River dams. That is a very complicated issue, and it creates very interesting alliances. It's a very interesting discussion where folks who are typically on the side of clean power are arguing to remove clean power, and folks who are typically on the side of dispatchable and fossil resources are actually arguing for the retention of a clean power resource. These are very complicated issues in terms of how they affect people, and there are no easy answers. I really love the discussion around talking about discernment and trade-offs. There is no simple answer to these types of questions, and all of them are both, every option looks good and bad at the same time. The way that energy is being used is changing dramatically. This is really important because it changes how we operate the system. I will say the Northwest in particular has been a leader in energy efficiency. We just have done incredible work in terms of improving efficiency, particularly in lighting and appliances, where both programs, standards, and market transformation have helped to move that market. But what that means now is like almost all of your energy use is heating, cooling. That's basically everything. And all of that is the hardest stuff to serve. It's when the power doesn't run. It's when things are really high. So load has become much peakier. Also, we had an interesting trend that sort of happened in the 80s and 90s, which is a move, and even in the 2000s, around a trend towards gas in this region. Historically, we had such cheap electricity, it was too cheap to meter, and everything was heated with electricity. We moved to natural gas as it became cheap, and now both natural gas prices are becoming more volatile, and we're looking to decarbonize, so we're trying to move back to electricity, which makes things very complicated. Across all of this is also the distribution of power. This is my house. This is Santa was putting solar in my house. We did it around Christmas. Rooftop solar is more expensive than utility scale solar. There's just no getting around that. However, it has different benefits and it affects people in different ways. When we look at reliability, if you putting power at people's homes helps them to keep the lights on with batteries. And it also helps to create wealth. So there's a big difference between you owning your own power and some giant monopoly utility owning your own power, and that really matters to a lot of folks. We're especially seeing this at the community level. Tribes are a great example as well, where you're seeing big investment in community resources to help keep money within the community, both in terms of the jobs that are going into building those resources and in terms of accruing the benefits and creating wealth within communities. So, getting to conclusions. What I think is really exciting about energy and renewable energy in general is that everybody can find something that they care about in this conversation. Any discipline. So my academic background is in like math. I did like applied math. I started in econ at PSU, but my graduate degree is there. And yet I like work in policy a lot now. And that's how weird energy is. We have folks who are engineers who work in programs, and we have people with social science backgrounds who are working in highly technical parts of the industry, because energy is everywhere. It is the blood. It is like what moves everything. And so it gives you a great opportunity to engage students by giving them a chance to find themselves in that conversation and in those thorny problems. It also provides great lessons in how to work through complex issues, because nothing is simple here. It's very easy to get caught up in polarization, but these are very thorny and complex issues. And the other exciting thing, particularly being educators in the Northwest, is that the Northwest has such a rich community in energy. We honestly have such a disproportionate community to what you would expect from a region of our size. When you look at like the hubs for renewable energy and energy efficiency, the Northwest is just largely represented, and that's because of a lot of the innovation that has come. So I just wanted to leave you with a few resources here. I'll send the slides. One, I mentioned the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. The other one that I would just encourage you is to engage with your utilities. Your utilities are incredible sources of information, and they are effectively public servants to your community. And so I will tell you, I used to do mentorship with high school students when I worked at Portland General Electric. It is a huge thing that the utilities are focused on, so please engage with them. In addition, talking to trade associations. If you want to learn about solar, reach out to OSEA, the Oregon Solar Energy Industries Alliance. They are very happy to talk to you about the trades and local community impacts and introducing you to sort of new concepts. There's also a lot of great industry news sources, so it's really easy to get caught up in the academics, but a lot of stuff is happening in real time. So I really encourage you to just reach out, and there's tons of resources here. And then, of course, if you want to get really geeky, I would encourage you to engage in some of the research organizations. The national labs are a great source of that, NREL, LBNL, but also some of the larger nonprofits, so RMI, Grid Lab, and others. So yeah, so that's it. And with that, I'm done. Sorry, I ran a little long.
Does anybody, we have just a few minutes for questions, or you can talk to Josh at lunch, but let's do a few questions.
Thanks for that. That was great. I'm very curious about the energy needs, and this may be a good question for you or for somebody else. Energy needs for data storage and the use of our phones, especially thinking about this with our youth and how their phones impact and where all the data is being stored and how that's impacted.
It's a good question, and it's actually a very salient one for the Northwest. So it's interesting, having a lot of cheap hydropower. I mean, we have some of the lowest electric rates in the United States because of federally subsidized power. Well, when you have excess power in certain pockets, somebody finds a way to use it. And what happens for us is that there's been a lot of data center development. If you go out to the Dalles, and you will just see these giant buildings. Those are all owned by like Google and Facebook, and they're just plugging right in to the dam effectively. It's a big area of concern. It's becoming more of an area of concern for two reasons. One, which is the one that gets a lot of publicity, is less efficient compute for specific uses, largely like blockchain and things like that. Storage has been getting more efficient, but the issue has been finding ways to diversify how storage is done, and that relies a lot on regional integration. So the issue right now is that if you don't have an ability to sort of transfer compute from different places, then they have a tendency to sort of overbuild, and that's been happening a lot on the data center side. The other issue they have largely in terms of like data centers and storage is that it is highly inflexible energy use. That is, it looks a lot like we would like look at industrial uses, it's like an aluminum smelter or something. It just runs which actually is funny because the aluminum smelters all got supplanted by the data centers. So basically, that used to be the data center before we had computers. It's just flat. It just runs effectively all the time. And that's a real problem. Like flexible loads are okay. So an example would be like some industrial processes like a rock crusher or a steel shredder. You can change the schedule in which you run one of those. Or I used to work with paper plants a lot. Paper plants were awesome, man. You could just talk to them and be like, hey, can you just run on Tuesday at 6 a.m.? And they would, and it was fine. But the fact that they're highly inflexible causes a lot of problems. The positive is that those tech companies have been some of the most aggressive purchasers of renewable energy and investors in new energy sources. A great example that just came up recently is the announcement from Fervo, which is a next generation geothermal plant that's being developed, and Google was extremely involved in that and was like the primary investor in that project. That's pretty common. In fact, before you could argue that a lot of the big corporate buyers helped lay the groundwork for some of the policies that came because they made these large commitments and purchases of like huge power plants to be developed, and that helped demonstrate the scale that was necessary for policymakers. So, but it's a complicated issue. The flip side also, I would just say from an economic development perspective, is that a lot of co-ops in this region get a lot of money and job development from those tech companies, and that can't be neglected, right? Like there are a lot of jobs out there in like, oh my God, North Wasco. Sorry, I was gonna get killed if I couldn't remember my right. North Wasco PUD, which is the public power that serves Google's data center. The jobs that maintain that data center, the money that comes into that utility, which gets just recirculated into the community, is really important as well. So it's complicated.
All right, with that, we got to get to lunch, but I think Josh is going to stick around during lunch, so you're welcome to talk to him or Amy or Ian or Brian if you have any questions.